This can be terribly weakening. The knight came back to e7, and now white played knight fe1. The idea is that white is going to start a pawn storm with f4 and then later on f5. But this is also very weakening indeed. White has one less pawn in front of his king, and somehow it's so slow I just can't believe it's going to work. Black continued with his plan of exchanging off the bishop with bishop to b5, an excellent move. And white blocked that with the knight. And now black played an excellent move. He moved his pawn up to h5. Now we can see that by delaying castling, black has actually benefited because his rook is still on the h-file. Now, the reason black played this is that when white takes, then black will have secured the f5 square again for the knight, and also it will have prevented white's pawn storm f4, f5. It's a superb move. White actually felt the need to attack the knight on a5 by playing the pawn to b4. Now again, I'm not sure about this move. I think it just weakens the squares too much. The square on c4 in particular, and down the c-file. Now instead of playing the knight into c4, which would allow the pawn to a4, attacking the bishop, and that's rather a bit nasty, it would have to retreat. Not the end of the world, but it's better if black plays the knight back to c6, and after a4, which white actually played, then the bishop comes to c4, and black still maintains the pressure on the d4 pawn. It's attacked by the queen on b6 and the knight on c6. White pushed on, attacking the queen, and it retreats to c7, so there's not so much pressure on d4 now. And finally, he had to deal with the problem of what to do about the pawn on h5, and white captured it. He didn't feel he could allow the h-file to be opened after, say, h3, and then black would open the h-file and have a strong attack. So he felt obliged to capture on h5, and black brought the knight back to this superb square f5, where it's attacking the pawn on d4 once again. And now white is in big trouble here. He brought the bishop to e3, defending the pawn on d4, but now black played his bishop into b3, attacking the knight on c2, which was defending the pawn on d4. It's so logical, black's play here. I really like it. Queen came to b1, forcing black to do something about the bishop on b3, so it's breaking the pin, and black took on c2, which is fine. He's knocked out one of the defenders, and black retreated the queen to d8 just to get out of that pin, and so the pawn on d4 is now attacked. The knight came to c5, which black exchanged off. And now queen takes, defending the pawn on d4, but white is in big trouble now. The rook came to c8, threatening knight takes e5. Queen had to sidestep, and black just castled now. White defended the pawn on d4, and now black played the queen to e7. Attacking the pawn on b4, white played king h1, and now he played queen to h4. I think he could have played queen h4 instead of queen e7 actually, but he did it in the end. he had another shot, and he played the correct move. And now white can't really defend the pawn on d4 satisfactorily. For instance, if queen to d3, then you just play knight takes b4. White played the bishop to f3, and black captured on d4, and that effectively was the end of the game. Once that pawn goes, that key pawn in white's position, then, well, black just has a winning position here. And indeed, he polished off the game very, very cleanly a few moves later. I don't think black has anything to fear from the advanced variation in the French, but there are a couple of tricky lines which you really ought to be aware of. On the sixth move, white has two interesting alternatives. One is to play the pawn to a3, with the idea of playing the pawn to b4, which cramps black's minor pieces on the queen side. It prevents, for instance, this manoeuvre knight to a5, which has featured in a couple of our games. The other move is bishop to d3. Now this is a much more active, aggressive square than, say, when you play the bishop to e2. This involves the gambit of a pawn and was first invented by Sir Stuart Milner-Barry, who was an England international in the 1930s and is still active in chess today. To exploit this aggressive bishop move, you must attack the pawn on d4. You must go for it. So take the pawn off on d4. White recaptures, and now play queen b6, attacking the pawn on d4. Now if white wants to save that pawn, he loses face. He can retreat the bishop back to e2, but then again he's lost time. Or putting the bishop back to c2, but that's a very poor move. Black will play knight to b4, attacking the bishop on c2. Now if that bishop goes, if it's exchanged off for the knight, then black is doing well. So for instance, if bishop b3, trying to save it, well then black plays bishop to b5, preventing white castling, threatening knight d3 check, and with a very, very strong position indeed. So in this position, white must gambit the pawn. That's his idea. So he castles, and black captures the pawn on d4. White takes the knight, and the queen comes to d4. And now white gambits a second pawn, very aggressive indeed. Place a knight out to c3. Now in this position, do not take the pawn on e5. If you do, queen takes e5, then a rook e1, and this is really dangerous. For instance, if queen b8, then knight takes d5. And white has got the pawn back, and black is lagging behind development. The position is broken open. Black is in big trouble here. The secret is, do not be too greedy. Now the knight comes to c3, and in many variations, knight to b5 is threatened. So black carefully should play the pawn out to a6. Now the queen comes to e2, protecting the pawn on e5. Now there are many ways for black to play this position, but the one I'm recommending is to get the queen out straight away. Just play the queen over to h4, so you don't have any problems with it getting trapped. Now white starts his attack by moving the pawn up to f4. White's pieces are aggressively placed. That bishop on d3 is on an excellent square, but black still has his solid central pawn chain, f7, e6 and d5, and he's a pawn up as well. Now knight h6. Now that's a sensible move, because it means that if black's queen is ever attacked, it can perhaps go to g4, but now the knight is protecting it on h6, and also from h6 the knight eventually might actually go to f5. We're actually following the game Rosenthalis Epichin from the Soviet Championship 1990. White's brought his bishop out to e3, black brought the rook to c8. Now white continued aggressively by bringing the rook up to f3. He wants to perhaps attack the queen with rook h3, and black play the bishop out to c5, exchanging off a pair of bishops and preparing perhaps to castle on the king side. I think chances are roughly equal here. I would prefer to play black just because, well, alright, I'm a bit greedy. I'd like my extra pawn. But white does have some attacking chances, but I don't think it's not too much to fear. You have a solid extra pawn here. So now the other move, pawn to a3, rather trendy move. White is trying to expand on the queen side, as I mentioned before, by playing b4, which rather cramps black's pieces. Okay, black would exchange perhaps, but you can now see how it's more difficult for black to operate, for instance, on the c file, because the maneuver knight to a5 to c4 is prevented. Black prevents white playing b4 by playing the pawn down to c4. Now if white plays b3 or perhaps b4, then black will take the pawn, white recaptures, and now black can play on the c file by playing the knight to a5, attacking the queen. Queen must move back, let's say to c2, and now rook c8, bearing down on the weak pawn on c3, and also perhaps you can use the square c4 by moving the knight in. So playing b4 would be a mistake. Instead, white plays the bishop out to e2. There are other methods of development, but this is perhaps the most common. We're now following the game Santana-Gulko from the New York Open 1988. Gulko played the queen out to b6, which demonstrates one of the weaknesses in white's position, namely the square on b3. Later on, black might be able to play the knight to a5, and then into that weakened square. That's one idea. Another idea might be to maneuver the bishop on d7 to a4, let's just suppose white's queen weren't there for a moment, and then perhaps into c2 and round to this diagonal, maybe into e4. Well, okay, that's, you might say, in your dreams, but occasionally it might happen. It's worth being aware of that this bishop can actually come out to a very useful diagonal. Okay, let's go back. White castled, and black chipped away at white's pawn chain straight away by playing the pawn out to f6. That's an excellent move. If white leaves that, then black will be able to capture on e5, and if white recaptures, then he could bring the bishop out to c5 and start building superb pressure down the f-file. Just imagine if black will be able to play knight e7 and then castle on the king side. Everything's now bearing down on f2. Also, the white pawn on e5 is weak, so all you need to do is play the knight to g6, and, well, the e5 pawn is very weak. Well, that's obviously strategically almost a winning position for black, actually. Yeah, especially when you have about 8 moves in a row, but that's beside the point. So in view of that, white captured on f6. And black recaptured with the pawn. In this situation, by far the best move. Remember that black hasn't committed his king yet. If it were on the king side, it's rather unclear. But here, black can castle on the queen side. Now, his king is much safer, and he has this superb pawn centre now. White played rook e1, and black brought out the bishop to d6, very aggressive square, pointing down towards white's king. White's knight came to d2, and knight came to e7. So smooth development. Knight f1, and now black castled on the queen side. Black has a superb position already. Great central pawn mass, chances to attack on the king side, and that's exactly how Gulko continued. Knight came to g3 and he advanced the pawn to h5. He'll try and push that as far as it can go. Bishop to f1, pawn came to h4, attacking the knight, which had to come back. And now if he plays h3, well, okay, the pawn will come up to g3 and the g file will be blocked, so instead he crashed through in the centre. Tremendous. White captured and black recaptured with the pawn. Well, let's just compare the two positions. Look at black's pawn centre. The pawn's on d5 and e5. They dominate the position. White really can't do anything against them. Black has